Hello. Welcome back to Human Sexuality. We're going to be talking this week about gender dysphoria and mental health issues in adolescence. My name is Robin. I think so. It was last week. Um, Let me start out by asking you: did you know that research shows that transgender and gender diverse individuals are at significantly higher risk of experiencing mental health issues compared to their cisgender peers? In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the unique mental health challenges faced by individuals with gender dysphoria and how we can work together to promote their mental wellness and overall well-being. So we have 5 learning objectives for today's lesson. By the end of this class, you will be able to describe the demographics of the transgender and gender diverse, that is TGD, community. You will be able to describe the prevalence of self-harm and suicidality among individuals diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and you will be able to describe the prevalence of mental illness in adolescents with gender dysphoria while noting the ranges reported in current research. Importantly, you will be able to use the minority stress model to explain the causes for increased prevalence of self-harm, suicidality, and mental illnesses among adolescents with gender dysphoria. And finally, and importantly, very important to me anyway, um, it's important that you are able to contextualize these statistics into the current political debate regarding gender affirming care for youth with gender dysphoria. So, any questions about what we're going to be doing today? Okay. Uh, the first objective is related to the demographics of transgender identity. The data on this slide is adapted from a very recently published study from the Williams Institute that combined data from several surveys of adolescents and used some advanced statistical modeling. As depicted in the pie chart on the left, the highest percentage of transgender identified people in the US are in the 13 to 17 age group, and that's followed closely by the 18 to 24 age group. It is noteworthy that in recent years, the transgender identified population of young people has nearly doubled. Now, one of the options for your weekly assignment might be, again, whether it's video recorded, audio recorded, or written, um, you might hypothesize about why that proportion has doubled in the past few years, and do some brainstorming. It's not necessary that you do any kind of a study. I think it's perfectly great if you just start out with a hypothesis and some brainstorming. Finally, the bar chart on the right compares the age group percentages in the transgender population relative to that of the general population. The chart highlights the point that the percentage of transgender adolescents ages 13 to 17 and young adults ages 18 to 24 is higher than the percentage of these age groups in the US general population, contrasted with the lower percentage of transgender adults aged 25 and older relative to that of the US general population. Okay, so um, let me stop here before we move on and ask you if there are any questions before we move on to talking about self-harm and suicidality related to gender dysphoria in adolescence. Okay, um, moving on. As you look over the statistics presented in this rather busy slide, for which I apologize, let me make a few comments. First, I noted above that there's a high lifetime prevalence of mental illness among people with gender dysphoria based on the minority stress model, and I did say we were going to discover that we were going to talk about that is one of the objectives for this week. The higher prevalence of mental illness is attributable to elevated rates of discrimination, victimization, bullying, and other forms of oppression, such as refusing to use the pronouns appropriate for one's gender identity or expression. Within this domain, it is important to note that receipt of gender-affirming healthcare, including puberty blockers and cross-gender hormones, is associated with decreased incidence of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidality. This is particularly important to know because nearly 25 states, half of the United States, have passed or introduced legislation to ban gender-affirming healthcare. In fact, in Alabama, it's a violation of Act 2022-284, will result in a Class C felony and up to 10 years in prison for anyone who prescribes or provides puberty blockers or cross-gender hormones to anyone under the age of 18. Now, I do not expect that you're going to remember all these statistics. I hope that you will use them in your final assignment or perhaps your weekly assignment. They're good resources. But the main point of this slide is to look at self-harm and suicidal ideations on the left, compare that to suicide attempts rates in the middle, and death by suicide on the right side. And you will see that the numbers for self-harm and suicidal ideations are much higher than suicide attempts, and suicide attempts are much higher than death by suicide. That is not a particularly surprising statistic or finding, but it is important for being an evidence-based clinician. It isn't sufficient to simply say, yes, transgender kiddos are at higher risk of suicide. You need some empirical base for knowing that, and the only way to do that is to know some of the statistics. Okay, so now let's talk about the prevalence of adolescent mental health. But let me pause first and ask if there are any questions. Okay, moving on. Thompson et al. Recently published a systematic review, basically a study of studies, regarding the prevalence of mental health problems reported in peer-reviewed literature for adolescents aged 12 to 17 who had presented to clinics for assessment for gender dysphoria. The graph on the left side depicts the prevalence rates, high in black, low in blue, of mental health issues reported by their study. As indicated in the graph, the differences in the ranges vary from a low of 1% for psychotic symptoms up to 56% for overall mental health at baseline. The graph on the right reflects the ratio of mental health issues in the adolescent population being assessed for gender dysphoria relative to the comparable population of adolescents of a similar age. As indicated in the graph, many of the lower prevalence percentages reported in Thompson et al.'s systematic review are actually less than the percentage reported in the general population of adolescents by or of comparable age. This is indicated by a ratio of less than 1.0, which is the case for half of the indices, including Asperger's spectrum disorder, anxiety, ADHD, and overall mental health at baseline. So we've pretty much reached the end, and before I ask you to do a little assignment, I want to remind you that we're talking about how research can influence recommendations to work with major medical associations and support gender-affirming care for youth, because many states are banning it. We talked today about people with gender dysphoria being a minority, the prevalence of self-harm and suicidality and mental health issues is much higher in this population. Estimates of mental illness and gender dysphoric population ranges widely for some diagnoses and much less for others. And minority stress model explains greater risks of self-harm, suicidality, and mental illness in the gender dysphoric population. We have about 45 seconds left, and what I'd like you to do is pair up in groups of 2, 3, 4, whatever you're comfortable with, and talk about the ways that what you've learned today can help working with people and with adolescents who have gender dysphoria, and what you would do to advocate for them, and buffer their experiences as a clinician, help them buffer against factors that would contribute to mental illness, and then work on social media, and we'll begin next class with a discussion.